He knew who he was. He knew where he was coming from. He knew what he wanted to do in life. This is what he wanted to be, a public interest physician, a physician that tried to make workplace safer, medicine safer, medical practice safer, strong, fair regulation by the FDA. And he knew right off that that was going to be what he was going to do the rest of his life, and he proved it.
That, of course, is Ralph talking about his longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Sid Wolf, whose life we celebrate today, because there's a good chance he saved your life or the life of someone you know. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrove, and along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve. Sad day.
And, of course, we have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello.
This is a truly sad day for us at the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Dr. Sidney Wolfe, one of the founders of Public Citizen and the director of the Health Research Group for over 50 years, passed away this week at age 86. In 1971, Sid was working at the National Institutes of Health when he got a tip that federal regulators were refusing to recall contaminated IV fluids that came from Abbott Laboratories. Hundreds of people were getting sick as a result, and a number of them died. Who did Sid call? Ralph Nader. Sid and Ralph teamed up to challenge the FDA and got enough press that a few days later, these dangerous IV fluids were taken off the market. And thus began a relationship that led to the founding of the Health Research Group at Public Citizen that over its storied history has gotten over 24 dangerous drugs off the market and has been the leading watchdog of defective and hazardous medical devices and been the bane of incompetent doctors. And I'm just scratching the surface here, folks. Dr. Sidney Wolfe was a true American hero who saved countless lives over the course of his unique career. We'll go into a lot more detail in this episode about what he accomplished, not only from Ralph, but others who worked with him and knew him as the passionate, forceful, tireless champion that he was. As always, somewhere along the line, we'll check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. So, without further ado, let us pay tribute to the incomparable Dr. Sidney Wolfe. And we're going to start with one of the people who marched shoulder to shoulder with Sid for over 50 years. That's you, Ralph.
Well, for over 50 years, Dr. Sidney Wolfe, who directed Public Citizen's Health Research Group, has been what I would call the doctor's doctor, stressing the prevention of trauma and sickness, stressing accountability for gouging and unsafe practices by the drug companies, and pushing for effective regulation by the Food and Drug Administration and the Occupational Safety and Health Agency. He produced many regular newsletters, books on worst pills, best pills, informed millions of people with life-saving information. This is information the patient could use. Being told to take a drug, to check in the book whether it was safe and effective, or whether it was ineffective, or whether it was unsafe and shouldn't be taken at all. He pressed successfully with regulatory petitions at the FDA and OSHA and litigation for removal of hundreds of unsafe and or ineffective drugs from the marketplace. And he was as indefatigable and incorruptible a super productive civic leader as there has been in our country. He reached millions of people because he was a great communicator on the nightly television news, national radio, and the super popular Phil Donahue show. And he would always name names, the names of bad drugs, unsafe medical devices, the names of corrupt corporations, even of sellout regulators in the FDA. He could do that because he was a stickler for accuracy and precision and scientific data. Millions of people are benefiting from his work. He's been at since 1971 and will continue his legacy far into the future. But there won't be another Dr. Sid Wolfe for a while, unfortunately. He really was one of a kind, and we're going to find out more about his life in this program.
Thank you, Ralph. Now we turn to Dr. Steffi Woolhandler and Dr. David Himmelstein. David?
Dr. Steffi Woolhandler and Dr. David Himmelstein are co-founders of the Physicians for National Health Program, which is a nonprofit research and education organization that advocates for single-payer national health insurance. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Steffi Woolhandler and Dr. David Himmelstein.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, our pleasure.
Welcome indeed. Well, we've known each other for a long time, Steffi and David, and you've worked with Sid for many years. And we are devoting this hour, listeners, to a review of the life of the great Sidney Wolfe, MD. He always wanted to be called Sid, very informal. But he's the doctor's doctor in my book. He was emphasizing prevention of trauma and injury, and he watchdogged the medical profession, the FDA, the drug industry, the medical device industry, and with his health research group, A Public Citizen, was a tremendous force for saving lives, injuries around the country, and also in other countries around the world as a result. Can you tell us about your work with Sidney and what he meant to you over the years, Stephanie?
Yeah, well, Sid taught me a lot of what I know about drug safety. As an internal medicine specialist, my job is often prescribing drugs, and they can certainly help. But drugs are substances that change the way your body works. So anything that can help can also harm. And Sid was insistent that those who sell drugs and profit from drugs have to prove that the drug is actually safe, that the harms do not outweigh the benefits. And for many, many drugs on the market in the United States, Sid and others found out that the harms were much greater than the benefits. In identifying literally dozens of drugs that were unsafe, that should not be used, Sid has saved hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of lives of Americans who, were threatened by unsafe drugs. He's also really created the field of drug safety within the academic medical community. David and I are also longtime med school professors and academics, and it would be hard to overstate his tremendous stature within the medical community as a kind of watchdog and touchstone about how you think about drug safety and assuring that the benefits of the drugs we prescribe as doctors are going to outweigh the harms to our patients.
And David, he brought both of you to my attention when you started writing those major articles in the New England Journal of Medicine about the waste and corruption and denial of benefits in the current so-called industrial healthcare system and all the benefits of single payer. You brought information in about single payer in Canada, free choice of doctor and hospital, no long inscrutable bills and billing fraud. And you started the intellectual, empirical research for single payer. And then you went up to Congress, you got some legislation in, testified, and he was very proud of you. And he would call me up when he got the New England Journal of Medicine articles and tell me about them. David, give me your view on how rigorous Sid was. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes because the drug company lobbyists and propaganda machine would have descended on him and his associates to try to discredit him. Give us an idea of how his standards were for the charges that he made against the drug companies and the medical device companies.
Well, Sid was meticulous about the truth. Sid insisted that you couldn't overstate what you didn't know, that the most important responsibility of doctors was to be honest with the patients, with the public, with the government about what we know and what we don't know. And often what we don't know is critically important. He never stretched the truth. That was important not just because others were watching and trying to find flaw in what he did, but it was inherent in Sid's character that he cared about telling the truth and about doing what was right. And I would say, in addition to the drug work that Steffi talked about, Sid taught me how you advocate for single payer and how you work on social change in our tangled government structures. We spent a year on sabbatical in Washington, and I actually worked with Sid full time for that year back 30 some years ago. And he really taught me how government works and how you work within government, and taught me how to focus single payer work in an effective way. And we went during that year many times to Congress together to meet with Henry Waxman, at that time the chair of the health subcommittee in House of Representatives, and others. And Sid was really the preeminent, not just scholar of drug safety and protection of what should be prioritized in healthcare, but also about how you move the country on these issues, not just as an academic exercise, but as a real world piece of work.
Well, speaking of moving the country, he was a tremendous communicator. He was on the Phil Donahue show, which had a 10 million audience at that time, very powerful show, and he would highlight his findings, especially the books that were called Worst Pills, Best Pills, which was a series of reports on brand name drugs, all of which were approved by the FDA, but some of them for the same ailment producing bad side effects, gastrointestinal bleeding, increased dizziness, for example, and others for the same ailment not producing. And that's why he came up with this title, Worst Pills, Best Pills. And he'd go through on the Donahue show with Phil leading him, one major drug after another. There would be gasps in the audience, like saying, I'm taking this drug and I have bleeding. And I don't have to take it. I could take another drug that's approved by the FDA that doesn't have that consequence. And in one show, Steffi and David, 500,000 copies were sold all over the country. People rushed to get this book, Worst Pills, Best Pills. They couldn't get that kind of information from most of their physicians. The FDA was not putting out this kind of information, was considered too controversial. Of course, it would produce an indictment of the FDA for not warning people in the first place. Well, he was a great communicator. He was on NBC, ABC, CBS all the time, NPR, PBS, and he was a real opponent of the commercialization of medicine and the commercialization of medical schools. Can you talk about that?
Well, that was really important. And I must say, when I returned to Harvard after the year in Washington with Sid, I brought that book back with me and insisted that the residents who I supervised actually pay attention to Sid's evaluation of drugs because the FDA's evaluation wasn't there. And you're right about his warnings about the commercialization of medicine and corporate malfeasance in all branches of healthcare. And that was part of why he embraced single payer health reform as an essential part of his agenda as well as ours.
I mean, Sid was a great communicator in another sense too. Like, even though he had a very radical critique of corporate power and a radical critique of the extent of corruption within government and within the medical community, he was also able to identify and persuade allies in all sorts of places. So some of them were folks who worked in government who actually cared about good public policy. Some of them were academics all over the country who became his friends and worked with him on various projects. Some of them were folks in the media who actually came to believe in the importance of the media in exposing corruption and exposing dangers to the American people. And part of that was he was so careful with facts and accuracy that you could really, if Sid said something, you could trust it. And it was very, very persuasive. And his ability to persuade people is part of how he was so effective in his work.
Well, he was a great networker. You know, he networked with people of all ages. He took a particular interest with young people. He'd have medical students as interns at the Health Research Group, and he'd speak at medical schools. Can you talk about his work with young people at all, David or Stephanie?
Well, he certainly worked with both of my daughters when they were teenagers. They came and lived with him, and Suzanne, Katie worked on your presidential campaign. That's my older daughter, Sid, Ralph, and Gracie, my younger daughter, worked with Rob Weissman on consumer product safety. But they were just teenagers, and now they're both physicians and social justice researchers in the field of medical care. So he certainly inspired them by showing the importance of good research, of good accuracy, and that it was possible to live as a progressive person within a profession and use your professional skills to implement social change. But I think he had that effect on dozens and dozens of students and young researchers and doctors in training that I saw, that I know, who worked with him at least one point in their lives.
Yeah, I have no idea who all of the people were, but as time went by in conversation with Sid and with others, it would pop up. Oh, yeah, before he went to medical school, he worked as an intern at Public Citizen. Josh Sharfstein, who was the second in command at the FDA later on and is now the associate dean of the public health school at Johns Hopkins. Josh, before he went to medical school, was a protege of Sid's. And that sort of thing came out routinely about other people who went on to distinguished, or maybe not highly recognized, but critically important careers and activities.
Well, you have a master's in public health, Stephanie, and Sid was quite critical of state departments of public health as being too cowardly. He raised the issue of how under-budgeted they were, how unprepared. Of course, we learned about that when the COVID-19 virus struck in 2020, how unprepared we were, not only at the national level under Trump, but at the state level. These departments of public health are besieged by corporate lobbyists, and they don't have the political support by governors for most cases, some exceptions. And that was part of his range. He had tremendous range. He even published several times a directory of physicians who had been disciplined by their state supervisory boards, either for incompetence or for economic shenanigans, and printed their names. That's another example of his accuracy. You have to be extremely accurate when you're talking about brand name drugs selling billions of dollars a year and doctors who are not working properly for their patients. Do you see a situation coming in the future where the medical schools producing more young Sid Wolfs? We're talking, listeners, in the memory of Dr. Sidney Wolfe, who passed away on January 1st at the age of 86, and left in his wake a tremendous legacy of written materials, newsletters, reports, congressional testimony, books, all to help people. They were books you could use if you were diabetic. He had a book on what you can do to do it without having bad side effects. Can we look forward to some medical schools turning out more young Sidney Wolfs? You've taught at medical schools, you know the tenor and the temperature there.
Well, certainly I see a large number of medical students are interested in social justice right now. I think they often have trouble figuring out how they can build a career that advances social justice. And I wish more of them had a chance to meet Sid Wolf. Unfortunately, none of them will going forward. But to see that you can use your medical skills, you can use your medical knowledge, you can use the attention to detail that medical school teaches you to advance the social justice agenda. So to make sure that people can have access to medications and medical care, that the medical care and medications they get are as safe as possible, that their doctors and their institutions are not being corrupted by corporate profit seeking. He demonstrated a way that people can work within the medical field and medical profession to advance a social justice agenda. And certainly he's influenced people in the past, and hopefully going forward, many more people can learn to use his ideas and methods for advancing social justice.
And he demonstrated he could live a very balanced life as well. He and Ava had 4 daughters, and he would take vacations. He was a runner. Even at his advanced age, he'd win contests in terms of running, and he was a very fine pianist. And so he showed that you could work 55 hours a week for social justice and still have a balanced life. I have never met anybody more incorruptible. I mean, there would be New York Stock Exchange brokers calling him about what he knows about drugs to see whether it would affect the stock valuation of a company that they were investing in. And I once told him, Sid, you get calls but from these stock analysts. There isn't anybody that's called you twice, right? Same person? Yeah, no. They never called Sid twice. He turned them off with a very stern lecture, never to call again. He was such a honest, high character compassionate personality. He would respond to all kinds of people, calling them relatives, friends, friends of friends with ailments, and he would calmly question them, give them advice, refer them to competent specialists, all pro bono, of course. That was one of his side hobbies, reaching out to people and showing that he wasn't just a tough analyst and scientific researcher, that he had a real heart. Well, thank you both for your heartfelt comments and memories of Dr. Sidney Wolfe. Before we close, is there anything you'd like to say that we didn't stimulate you in saying?
Well, we miss Sid, but the only thing that will miss Sid more than us is the rest of the world.
Well said. Thank you very much. We've been speaking with Dr. David Himmelstein and Dr. Steffi Woolhandler. We hope that you will be part of extending his legacy going into the next few years.
Would be our highest aspiration.
Up next, we'll welcome Robert Weissman, the president of Public Citizen. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, January 5, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. On the afternoon of May 8, 2023, Cass Grusbeck, age 20, was trying to clear an obstruction on an overhead package conveyor at an Amazon distribution center in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was en route to the jam in an elevated lift when his head collided with the conveyor and became trapped by the machinery. That's according to a September 18th safety order. He died of blunt force injuries. After an 11-week investigation, Indiana safety officials found that Amazon failed to ensure a workplace, quote, free from recognized hazards that were causing or likely to cause death, and issued a serious safety citation. That's going to report in the Washington Post. The penalty, a $7,000 fine, the maximum allowed in Indiana. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Ralph, and the rest of the team, as we continue our celebration of the life and career of Dr. Sidney Wolfe. David?
Robert Weissman is the president of Public Citizen, where he spearheads the effort to loosen the chokehold corporations and the wealthy have over our democracy. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Robert Weissman.
Great to be with you.
Very sad time, Robert. And I was reading what you put on Public Citizen's website, citizen.org, and you said about Sid that he invented a new approach of research-based advocacy to get dangerous drugs and devices off the market, win new protections for worker health and safety, address doctor misconduct, challenge the Food and Drug Administration to its job, and hold pharmaceutical companies accountable. Sid was brilliant. He won a MacArthur Genius Grant and fearless in his advocacy. But what was most singular about him professionally was his passion for advancing health justice. There was a distinctive fierceness and fury to his work. Everyone who knew or even encountered Sid, allies and adversaries alike, experienced his intensity, end quote. He was fierce, but he rarely raised his voice, and he was under full control of his rational arguments, but his tone was one of great urgency, wasn't it?
Well, absolutely. And, I hope everybody reading that, as you're reading it, Ralph, appreciates that I'm talking about his passion around issues of injustice, right and wrong, life and death. As a human being, as I also described, and as you know, it was true for you as well, he was a dear friend and very gentle and soft and funny and, with widely diverse interests. And also, for many people who knew him, especially here at Public Citizen, he was a doctor. So some of the commentary about him over the years was he didn't maintain a practice of treating patients, which was true as far as it went. But if you called Sid and said, I have a problem, he would attend to you. And all of the sharp edges dropped away. And he was the kindest doctor with a bedside manner from 100 years ago, and would spend so much time with folks here at Public Citizen and in his social network, and really made fundamental differences in people's lives in this organization and among our friends and networks as a doctor in a way that you really can't get from any doctor you might go to in a practice.
Yeah, it really was amazing. It never turned a request down. you'd go to him and you'd say, look, this person is really ill, and the person's pretty well known in the field and is doing great work for humanity. He said, that doesn't matter to me, whether he's doing great work for humanity or whether he's well known or not. What only matters is that the person is a human being. That's something he was very insistent on. Tell us about the Health Research Group's health letter, its publications, especially the outrage of the month that Sid devised.
Among the just remarkable things about Sid is he did invent this whole new way of doing advocacy. And he understood, very much as he learned along with you, Ralph, that it wasn't just about marshaling the facts, that you had to both mobilize people, but also in the consumer health space, educate people. And so he was able to not just do this original research on drug safety, but find ways to communicate to people in clear and understandable ways information that they could act on in their day-to-day lives. So he, with colleagues, published first a large book called Worst Pills, Best Pills, which was a compendium of drugs on the market and telling you which ones were safe or which ones you should exercise caution about and which ones you should avoid. It was just an invaluable tool. Over time, the multiple editions of that book sold 2.5 million copies, promoted in significant part by Sid's appearances on Phil Donahue's show, where he was able to represent what we're discussing, his ability to communicate complicated information in ways that were really understandable and clear and that people could trust. And so people saw Sid on Donahue's show, trusted him, and then bought this low-price book that was really impactful in their lives. He created a newsletter along with that, Worst Pills, Best Pills newsletter, which at its peak had 150,000 in circulation. He published a monthly health letter, just looking at public health issues. And as you said, that included a monthly outrage of the month. Outrage may have been Sid's catchphrase because he saw so much outrageous in the health field, precisely because he knew that things were being put on the market that shouldn't be, or services were being withheld from people that shouldn't be, not because of any lack of information, but because of the improper influence and political power and economic power of Big Pharma and the for-profit health insurance industry. And he was outraged about that because he understood it rightfully as a matter of life and death. To bring it full circle to what you're saying, Ralph, life and death for real human beings, people he may not know, but real human beings were going to be affected by this. And he found that as outrageous as if it were affecting someone he did know.
Well, he put out 2 bestsellers called Drugs That Don't Work and then Over-the-Counter Drugs That Don't Work. And within 15 years, hundreds of these drugs were taken off the market because they were ineffective and or unsafe, which was against federal law. But until the people found out about this by brand name or whatever, the FDA just sat and did nothing. So that's another consequence of his advocacy. Tell us a story that Sid always liked to tell about our first venture together with the Abbott Labs contaminated intravenous fluids.
Well, I should really be asking you, but as I understand the story, Sid got a tip that Abbott Labs was selling intravenous fluid around the country that was impure and killing people. The FDA knew about it, but made a decision that it couldn't remove it from the market because intravenous fluids are so important. So with you, he wrote a letter to the FDA, I think at your suggestion, saying, hey, this is happening. Released that letter to the press. It became big news. I've got copies of the original stories that came out in response to that letter. And then within a few days, the product had been removed from the market. That might have been a false indicator of the success that was to come. I mean, it's pretty good. You write a letter, you get the product removed, you save hundreds of lives. You're pretty inspired to go forward. As Sid really knew at the time, and as he would discover through 50 years of work, wasn't usually that fast. But he had a lot of success building on that model over the many decades to come.
Well, when he graduated from Case Western Reserve Medical School, he went to work at the National Institutes of Health in the area of alcoholism, and he was very highly regarded as a scientist there. He had already gotten a chemical engineering degree from Cornell, so he would often call me up, and I would say, what about this drug, or what about this device? And if there wasn't any evidence, he would say, there's no data, there's no clinical data. So he wasn't knee-jerk at all. It was all what the data was, what the studies were in the medical journals and other professional scientific outlets. And he would read all these journal articles and keep up to date. And his desk was piled with materials. And he loved his work. I think that he had that emotional intelligence that went with his cognitive intelligence, which makes all the difference, Robert, in terms of whether someone just knows something and bewails it, or someone just knows something and connects it to action that saves people's lives, prevents injuries. On your narrative on the website for Public Citizen, listeners, you can get the whole description of Sid's career and the work he did with his colleagues at Public Citizen by going to citizen.org. But you point out some of his and his colleagues' accomplishments. One was he forced 28 dangerous medications off the market, limiting the use of 10 more and adding strong warnings to dozens of others. These are medications taken by millions of people. Millions of people today are living or are not as sick because of the work of the Health Research Group led by Dr. Sidney Wolfe. He pushed the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to set more than a dozen worker protective health standards. He was particularly hard on silica and the horrible effects on workers' respiratory systems. He testified for hundreds of FDA advisory committees urging against approval by the FDA of dangerous drugs and medical devices, or for limited use or strong warning labels of others. And it just goes on and on. He went after red dye number 2 in your food supply because of its connection to cancer. He helped children survive Ray's syndrome by putting a warning on an aspirin bottle. He won access by the public, citizens, to safety and efficacy information for products being considered for approval by the FDA. And he was very early in condemning these drug company marketing of dangerous opiates, which last year took over 120,000 American lives. So there were a lot of warnings he put out, and nothing was done for years and years, which would just fuel his indignation. What do you see for the future of the Health Research Group, Rob, since you're president of Public Citizen?
Well, as we're mourning him and spending a lot of time inside the organization, remembering him and grieving, I think we're also trying to not just appreciate him, but learn from and be inspired by that example, his humanity and his passion, and the ways that, the specific kinds of advocacy approaches that he invented, but also the spirit of being constantly creative in that way. And of course, the only true way to honor him is to lean into the work, to continue doing it. As you know, Sid was 86. Before he got the brain tumor, he had no intention of slowing down. He was confident that he had another 10 years of work left to do for him. Not that he thought it was going to be done in 10 years, but he was planning on continuing the work. So we're doubly duty bound to do exactly that and keep trying to carry forward that mission in the areas that he was working on and in areas related. And as you're alluding to, Ralph, he was really deep in what he was doing, but the breadth of topics that he took on, it's really hard to wrap your head around. Includes everything from besides what we've already talked about, everything from mental health care in county jails to tobacco and on and on. So there's a lot more for us to do, and we intend to do it.
And he never got jaded. He was as indignant at 80 years of age as he was at 30 years. He never got jaded in confronting injustice. A lot of people get tired, they get burnt out. He had that inner energy because of his authenticity, and we're going to miss him terribly. Thank you very much, Robert Weissman.
Thanks, Ralph. It's an honor to be with you to talk about a great man.
We've been speaking with Robert Weissman. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
Stand up, stand up.
Our final guest today is Dr. Peter Lurie. David?
Dr. Peter Lurie is president and executive director of the Center for Science and the Public Interest. Dr. Lurie previously worked with the Food and Drug Administration and Public Citizens Health Research Group, where he co-authored their Worst Pills, Best Pills Consumer Guide to Medications. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Peter Lurie.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Peter. Before we get into the Food and Drug Administration and the work that Sid, you and others did on that agency before you became an associate commissioner of it, tell us a bit about your experience working with Sid.
Well, I got to say that Sid is a person who changed the direction of my life without question. I first met him when I was a medical student. I applied for a job. I'd gotten thoroughly fed up with medical school and how irrelevant what they were teaching us appeared to be, and went down to Washington and interviewed with Sid. He hired me on the spot, and I took a year with him, and it absolutely changed my life. That was in 1984, and I worked on and off with him for a 25-year period after that. Sid is, you'll get this from lots of people, but, he's a one-of-a-kind person, and that is just irrefutable. He created an entire new approach to advocacy in the medical world that simply did not exist before. Yes, there were some people who had done work on the side advocating for the public health, but I don't know any physician who took it on full-time in the way that Sid did. And in so doing, he created a model for a small number of privileged people like myself to follow. Most people don't have the time or be set up in such a way that they can do it, but Sid created it out of nothing. Public interest lawyers existed, yes, for years, but public interest doctors were unheard of. He was the first, and it'll be impossible to replace him.
Well, one of the areas he concentrated on was try to get the Food and Drug Administration to be a real enforcement agency and not a toady or a procrastinator on behalf of the swarming drug industry lobbyists that worked the agency over. Could you tell us what the approach that you all took to the Food and Drug Administration? What were some of the problems that you had to deal with? And he was particularly upset when the Congress established this fee system where they required the drug companies to fund the regulatory work of the Food and Drug Administration. He felt that was an inducement to conflicts of interest and corruption. So could you give us a review of what you all were working on with the FDA?
Well, let me just say that to return to the previous theme for a moment while answering this question, Sid was a pioneer in the methods for influencing the Food and Drug Administration. I mean, he was one of the first people to take advantage of the public session in a advisory committee meetings where you can show up as an ordinary member of the public and have your say. He was one of the first people to take advantage of the citizen petition process to put issues before the agency in a way that they had to respond to. And when the agency either didn't respond to us or took too long to do so, or sometimes responded in a way that we didn't like, then he was one of the first people to turn to the courts and to public citizens' internal litigators to be able to actually really hold the agency's feet to the fire. So he used these mechanisms that were there and that are now commonplace in advocacy, including in the medical setting, for the very first time. And he showed all of us how to harness those tools. And when he did that, it was always based on science, and it was always based on data. Very few people would show up in a public session or write a petition that was more technically able, more technically precise, more correct, frankly, than Sid. Plenty of people are using those petitions now, but the public citizen ones were ones that always made the agency pay attention. And I can tell you this from working on the inside. Even when they weren't welcomed, people knew that he was onto at least something. It was always, here's a person with credibility, with sincerity, who does not have a conflict of interest, who has put a lot of time into thinking about this, who has combed through the medical journals in order to know the issue well, and he will have put it together on a piece of paper right for you. And with that, he drove the agenda for the agency.
Well, one of Sid's regrets was that he was raising the alarm about antimicrobial resistance because of the overuse by doctors and hospitals of antibiotics. And he took the available data over 40 years ago was available. Every year, about 100,000 people would die because the antibiotics they took didn't work because of the microbes mutating from the overuse of these antibiotics. And you worked on this at the FDA when you were Associate Commissioner for Public Health Strategy. Give us a little capsule history of this constant struggle to control the use of antibiotics and why it has mostly not succeeded.
Yeah, well, I can remember working with Sid on that in 84 or 85. He was invited to testify before some congressional committee and put together this testimony. He had some kind of insider, God, I don't know where, but he had some person who every year would send us these enormous volumes. I mean, they were maybe 3 inches thick, each of them, which had detailed information about prescribing. You had to pay thousands and thousands of dollars to get hold of these, and we public citizen clearly couldn't do that. But he had somebody who sent it to him, and every year it would come. And there'd be this moment where it would come in the door, and everybody knew that the Xerox machines had to be, set free because it all had to be copied for the year. And he would go through this, and somebody would copy it, and then he'd come through this very dense data, and he used that for the testimony, and it was very effective. I remember he pulled out the number of antibiotics that was said to be being prescribed for the cold. Then that correct number is 0. But of course, that wasn't the number that appeared in the database at all. There were hundreds of thousands of such prescriptions. And he had a few other examples. And they were just very simple examples of clearly irrational behavior that the doctors were engaging in. And that was, I don't know if it was the first work he did on it, but that's the part that I did with him. The other part of it was always the animal side. And there, we were able to show when I was at FDA that the majority of antibiotic use actually is in animals, not in humans, because they're fed, in vast numbers on feedlots. And at the time that I was at FDA, we did take some action that has actually reduced the use in that way. But overall, Ralph, you're absolutely right. This remains, a critical problem going forward. There are, estimates of millions of people dying as a consequence of this in the not so distant future. But it's a very difficult problem in that the causes are multiple and the problems are diverse. And it's been very hard to get a proper handle on it. So he was absolutely right.
He wanted to educate patients about antibiotics. Could you tell our listeners what the proper approach of a patient should be when the patient has a cold, mostly viral? Explain what they should be alert to if a doctor tries to automatically prescribe an antibiotic to make the patient feel good.
Right. So, that's actually something Sid did in a general level, was that he would always try to empower people, and partly through our book and newsletter, Worst Pills, Best Pills, to have the right questions to ask doctors. And the Worst Pills, Best Pills even had a section, as I remember it, 10 questions to ask your doctor. Whenever somebody prescribes you an antibiotic, a perfectly good question to the doctor is, do you really need to do that, doc? That's a fair question. Because a lot of the time, they're not so sure themselves. A lot of the time, they've talked themselves into it. A lot of the time, they're doing it because they're afraid of what might happen if they don't prescribe. And it's a kind of insurance for the doctors themselves. And so if you push them even a little, that might be enough for the doctor to change their mind and take an appropriate antibiotic-free approach, which is the one that you should on any cold. If the person says, I really think this is a cold, the doctor is going to be hard-pressed to come up with a good justification for prescribing.
Well, let's go back to the Food and Drug Administration. What do you think people should know about what this agency is doing and not doing?
Well, I think Sid was the person who really held their feet to the fire and held us, or even me when I was there, accountable. He was the person who raised the impertinent questions. He was the person who asked why you couldn't do more, or he was the question who asked why you did what you had done. And all of those were appropriate to do. And all of those challenged the agency in ways that I think were healthy, even if not always welcomed by the agency. So, Sid was there for, I was going back and taking a look at some of the drugs we worked on together. God, it's just what a list we have. And that's just the ones that I worked on, to say nothing of all of the many people who came through the health group and were trained by Sid over the years. Botox, Irissa, hormone replacement therapy, statins, a drug called Araflex, Resolin, Orlistat, all kinds of weight loss drugs, Viagra, you name it. I mean, Sid was involved in all of it. He had something to say about just about every major drug that ever came through. And most of the time, it was to say something like, were the data strong enough to really justify what you're saying? Were they strong enough to prove that the drug worked? Because sometimes, in his view, and I think often correctly, they didn't? Or were the data strong enough to not include the warning that Sid thought ought to be included, and that would be necessary in order for the doctors or the patients to fully understand the risk-benefit ratio for the drug? So it was all about, science-based advocacy and holding the agency accountable and calling them out when he saw them making a mistake.
And how is the FDA right now in terms of its leadership, in terms of its public information, in terms of getting bad or ineffective drugs off the market and medical devices?
Well, I think there are some reasons for concern at the moment that a number of drugs have come on the market with rather feeble supporting evidence in recent years. There's been a couple of Alzheimer's drugs for which that's true, a drug for Duchenne muscular dystrophy as well. And these are well publicized. Some of them are instances in which internal people at FDA recommended against approval. Others are ones in which FDA's advisors from the outside world recommended against approval. And yet the agency found a way to approve them anyway. So, Sid is the person who articulated that point of view. I think in recent years, he took some roles advocating for the drugs that actually clearly are effective and clearly useful. And a couple of those were Narcan for the treatment of opioid overdose, which he and I worked a little bit on together, and I worked on a lot while at FDA. And another was the vaccines for COVID. Those were breakthrough products, no question. And Sid and I, we both actually testified before one of those FDA advisory committees on the COVID vaccines. And it was kind of funny to have both of us, completely separate rooms, of course, during the pandemic, advocating at the same meeting. It was kind of an ironic and its way very enjoyable experience.
Well, we've been talking with Dr. Peter Lurie, who is the President and Executive Director of the Center for Science and the Public Interest, that puts out this wonderful newsletter, Nutrition Action, which I give as a gift to people now and then. And it sort of couples itself with the Worst Pills, Best Pills newsletter that has been produced by the Health Research Group. You can't do better than subscribe to both of those, Peter. You're supervising 65 people in the Center for Science and Public Interest, one of the largest citizen groups in Washington, D.C. The SID's intensity, emotional intelligence, level of evidence-based indignation have something worthwhile to have your staff dig into and absorb, because too often people get jaded, they get tired, they burn out. And to have an example like Sid Wolf tends to produce a resurgence, a revitalization, a self-renewal at the optimum. And isn't it worth bringing Sid's career to the attention of your own staff there and other people and other citizen groups?
Well, certainly so. And, this program will do that, no question. It is remarkable what Sid accomplished with a much smaller staff than I have. Going back and looking at all the stuff that we put out, it just how he did it. It's almost unimaginable, quite how productive it all was. And, one of the things that I learned from him, we did a project to put a warning label, a box warning label on the box of aspirin. Sid asserted, correctly as it turns out, that children with chickenpox or the flu who were fed or given aspirin to control their fevers were at more risk of a fairly rare but very serious condition called Rye syndrome. And he Sid wanted to get a box warning on it, and was resisted by FDA and resisted by the industry, which created these front groups and affected the Reagan administration such that a warning that seemed on the cusp of happening got pulled back. And Sid was the person who fought that. And ultimately, he pushed National Academy of Sciences to do a study that proved it beyond any measure of doubt. And the warning, is there. In fact, what's ended up happening is that people don't use aspirin for children very much anymore, which is frankly even better than a box warning. But the thing that I learned from that was that you could win. That's what I learned from Sid. I didn't think personally that you could actually win in this life. What I thought that I would do was tilted windmills, for the rest of my life, fight the good fight, maybe be an honorable person, maybe my kids would appreciate it. That's all I really thought would happen. But what Sid showed me was that if you picked the right project, if you picked the project that was the right size, that involved a question that was actually being posed to a regulatory agency. And by the way, he was always more interested in the regulatory agencies than the Congress, which I think itself was an insight, especially for a science-based person like him. If you picked that right size project and you brought the right data to bear, you actually could win. You could get that warning on the box. And if you won the first time, that told you that you could win a second and a third and a fourth time. And that is what keeps you going. That's the important element of, psychological reward that people need to keep in the work. If you set your sights in ways that are too expansive, you'll just lose incessantly and eventually you'll give up. But Sid understood how to find that project that was not so small that it didn't matter, but not so massive that you stood no chance of making a difference. And he found that sweet spot over and over and over again.
And listeners should know that there never was over 12 full-time people at the Public Citizen Health Research Group.
Yep.
That's what a dozen people were able to do. I mean, the whole budget was just a fraction of what one CEO makes of a major company a year. And people should take heart from that. Also, our listeners should know that if they're on any prescription drugs or they're taking over-the-counter medications, they can learn about whether they should be taking them, whether they're safe, whether they're effective, or whether they're designated as do not use by the Health Research Group Worst Pills, Best Pills database. And you can get access to that database that's kept up to date regularly 24/7 by just sending in $15. Go to Health Research Group at Public Citizen. You can enter it through the website citizen.org and sign up. So whenever you have a bad side effect or a friend or relative or neighbor, you can check it out and see whether that dizziness, that nausea, that fall, that gastrointestinal bleeding, or other side effects was connected to the medication that the person was taking. It's one of the best deals in the consumer world. The Worst Pills, Best Pills database. There's also a print newsletter that you can get if you wish. What else would you like to say, Peter?
Well, the one other thing I would add is, we've talked a lot about Sidney's work and all of his many accomplishments, and importantly, the way he changed the lives of people like myself and created new generations of activists who can in turn train more activists and so on and so forth. But Sid was, it's an overused phrase, and it applies to very few people to whom it is applied. In actual fact, he actually was a Renaissance man. He really was. I mean, this is a person, he worked hard as hell. I mean, except for maybe you, Ralph. I don't know anybody who works, harder than Sid. But at the same time, he played the piano. He ran. He was, I remember going on a run with him, 35 years ago, which he was still sprinting 200 meters, and he had me timing him. He was mad for every kind of culture that he could get, his hands or ears or eyes upon, be it, painting, music, especially, jazz, I would say maybe perhaps in particular. He just had a thirst for life, really, an ability to embrace things, to try everything, just a kind of breadth that you don't often find in people. And that is something rare and something that I was lucky to come into contact with.
He had a zest for a full life, is another way to put it. Steve?
Yep. Well, actually, you just answered the question that I was going to ask you about his range of interests. So I'm going to defer to David and Hannah at this point.
What is the difference between being indignant and angry? Sid has been described as indignant, but not angry. What's the difference?
Well, I think the word that you probably would use is outraged. That was always the word that people used. He had a column called Outrage of the Month. When we first put together the health letter, which was a kind of predecessor to Worst Pills, Best Pills, he said, we need a column called Outrage of the Month. And I remember thinking to myself, God, are we going to have to come up with something every month? We'll never be able to fill that. Good God, are you kidding me? It was a piece of cake. I mean, there's never a problem. There's always something. Sid was just full of outrage all the time. But the difference really, and the main point is, there's a difference between being angry and as a result, being sort of rendered immobile. And then there's a person who takes anger and uses it as a spur to action. That's the important distinction, and Sid understood that better than anybody.
Well, we could go on and on about your work with Sid on worker exposure to beryllium and other hazards in the workplace, but we're unfortunately out of time. We've been talking with Dr. Peter Lurie, who's the President and Executive Director of the Center for Science and Public Interest, which has a heavy focus on food safety and food safety regulation and nutrition, among other issues that the center works on. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to think back. It is such a sad time about all of the positive things that Sid was able to bring to this world.
Stand up, stand up.
We've been speaking with Dr. Peter Lurie. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Dr. Steffi Wohlhandler, Dr. David Himmelstein, Robert Weissman, and Dr. Peter Lurie. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
We have a new issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen. It's out now. To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember, to continue the conversation after each show, go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. As we recorded this, listeners, be very alert for a possibility of a wider war in the Middle East. Israel has taken its weapons into Lebanon by drone, which analysts in this country and Israel are viewing as an escalation which could involve a broader war engaging U.S. soldiers and sailors. And who knows what the repercussions will be on the world at large and our own country. We have to have a ceasefire. We have to have peace negotiations. And Joe Biden's got to put some strength in his backbone and begin to tell Netanyahu to stop trying to goad us into a wider conflict.
You ought to step out. Rise up, I know you